Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to Season 4 of the Vimy Foundation's podcast, Beyond the Ridge, a series exploring Canada's contributions to the First World War and the experts who continue to uncover our past. Joining us this season as we discuss the topic of forgotten fronts, where we will be covering stories of lesser known areas of the war. My name is Caitlin Bailey, and I'm your host. While many Canadians are familiar with major Western Front battles like Vimy Ridge, the Second Battle of Ypres in Flanders in 1915 was a pivotal moment for Canada. This battle marked the first large-scale use of poison chlorine gas by the German army and was also the first major Canadian engagement since our entry in the war in the fall of 1914. Second Ypres was hugely important to the Canadian war narrative during the first years of the war, but after 1917, it was eclipsed by subsequent victories, and in the century after that has become mostly forgotten in public memory. Here to speak to us about this eclipse and the question of public memory itself is Dr. Geoffrey Bird. Dr. Bird is a professor in the School of Communication and Culture at Royal Roads University. He was previously a heritage interpreter at the Vimy Ridge Memorial before working in government in British Columbia and then overseas in the fields of education, community development, and poverty alleviation. While at Royal Roads University, he started the War Heritage Research Initiative, writing, directing, and producing over 30 films on sites of memory and the stories told by veterans, witnesses, historians, and other guardians of remembrance. Jeff's latest effort is called Ways We Remember War, the Second Battle of Ypres and Canada's Memory. So welcome, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Caitlin.
It's a pleasure to have you with us. I really like that term, guardians of remembrance. That makes me feel quite special as a guardian of remembrance myself.
Well, you are indeed. People that are working in this field, heritage interpreters, managers of sites, people that are engaged in remembrance and commemoration. And often it's a person who's living in a community who knows the story of a
Mhm,
particular marker that everyone has generally forgotten. And
mhm,
and as of course, as we march on, those guardians are pass on, and some of
mhm.
those stories are lost. Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, any of us in our community could be a guardian of remembrance
exactly.
under that definition, which I think is really nice. It's an important thing for all of us to remember when we live in a place and what we can contribute to that place. So we mentioned earlier, and on the topic of Guardians of Remembrance, you did work as a heritage interpreter at the Canadian National Vimy Memorial in Vimy Ridge. That would have been what, in the 1990s?
Yeah, 1990 to be precise.
1990 to be exact. And you've now turned your attention to war memory and documentary filmmaking. Um, what was it really that kind of drew you to that idea of bringing this to a public audience?
Well, I could start with that time when I was at Vimy Ridge as a guide in 1990. It was something that I had always wanted to do. As soon as I heard that they hired guides, and the whole idea of being at that place and to, essentially you're in a position where you're representing Canada. You're telling the general public, Canadians, and other visitors from around the world about this place and its meaning for Canadians. And it was the reason why I took French as my minor, and so I took time off from the Naval Reserve. I was an officer in the reserve, and I was able to go there. And I was just always, I think even before then, when I was a young boy, and my father took me to places like Gettysburg and Little Bighorn in the United States, I was sensing that power of place. It's kind of a sense of hauntedness. And of course, this is something
Mhm.
we completely are constructing in our own minds, where we're trying to
Absolutely.
imagine the past, and we're trying to, really try to picture it in our minds. And it's a form of time travel, really. So when I was at a guide at Vimy, we would often engage in that, particularly say in the tunnels. Uh,
Mhm.
and today the tunnels are a little bit different. We had a little bit greater access, and we had a few veterans, World War I veterans, still showing up at the park.
Mhm.
And there were times when you could really feel a greater connection to the past. You would find a World War I veteran, and he would be telling you something that happened, and you'd just be standing and there'd be crowds of people on a Sunday that are walking around the memorial, and you would be transported back. And so that's why I really wanted to get into this kind of work, the power of place, and
Mhm.
particularly with battlefields and the stories they tell.
Mhm. Well, it's really, it's true. It's that idea of like what we make of a place and what is it? Is it a field? Is it more than a field? Is it, any of those things? I think that make these the way they are, and that sense of, I felt this feeling. I felt these people here with me, and it comes to the people like you and the people who are on those sites who kind of build that for people,
And
in one
that
way or
is,
another.
and you're right, that is another part of this. Like it's not just, oh, there's a field and you can stand on, you can feel the past. It's you need to have a narration.
Hmm.
So, if you look at Vimy, it is an open field upon which we place a story.
Hmm.
Story has connections. We talk about mythology, and mythology isn't a bad word. It's not, societies use mythologies to
Hmm.
frame who they are, and we identify with those stories from our perspective of national identity and maybe our social identity. And so,
Hmm.
and we have to always be careful about the narrations we use and how
Hmm.
they're used. But that whole thing of the narration, the guardian of remembrance who tells that story of that place, is really the opportunity to, essentially reach and draw from the past and draw on, that it's, I was going to say it's resonance, a term I like to use is resonance of remembrance when we go to these places. It's a form of
Hmm.
transformative learning, really.
Hmm.
More so than sitting at home watching a film or going down to the local cenotaph, which is all very important. When we're at a battlefield, um, and we have the story told to us, there's a different connection we get with the past.
Absolutely. So bringing us into that idea of, remembrance and fields, specifically in battlefields, and that idea of a place and a thing. Um, your latest documentary is not about Vimy. It is about the Second Battle of Ypres, which, as we mentioned earlier, is kind of the first point where Canada actually engages as an army. There are other engagements slightly before Ypres, but Second Ypres in May 1915 is kind of where we see the first division, the rubber hitting the road, so to speak. Um, so can you tell us a little bit about what inspired you specifically to make a film about Second Ypres, and not another battle in the First World War?
The journey started in 2015 when I was asked by an Australian colleague, Bruce Skates, Dr. Bruce Skates. He does a lot of work around Gallipoli and the
Hmm.
Anzac experience. Um, and he said, we're having a conference down in Turkey to mark the 1915 action of the landings and the months that followed, the campaign that followed at Gallipoli. And would you come and tell us the Canadian story of April
Hmm.
1915 so we can kind of parallel it up? And we have the French coming. And so I had done a lot of Second World War work, particularly around Normandy and the D-Day beaches and remembrance there. And so I jumped at the opportunity, and I had several months to work at it, but I was trying to dig deeper into that layer. And of course, when we're talking about April of 1915, when the Anzacs landed along with the French and the English troops, the British troops, I should say, that is Anzac Day today.
Yes,
That
yeah.
that is a special day in the Australian national calendar. We are a few days earlier in our action at a place called Kitchener's Wood, April 22nd.
Hmm.
5 o'clock, there's the gas attack, blows a massive hole in the salient, and then the Canadians are called on to step into that gap and
Yes.
action late at night, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, a little later on. But the what I found really intriguing with that is didn't really there was no photographs.
Hmm.
There's nothing other than, we're working with paintings a lot of the time
Yes.
about Second Deep. So I had a chance to chat with colleagues in the Calgary Highlanders
Hmm.
first, and they invited me to the pilgrimage in
Hmm.
April of 2015. So the Calgary Highlanders and the Canadian Scottish are the two reserve regiments that actually continue and perpetuate the memory of the 10th and 16th battalions, the two battalions that fought that night at Kitchener's Wood.
Hmm.
So we had a service at the beautiful site of the Brooding Soldier, such a powerful, resonant monument in itself. And then that night, we actually went to Kitchener's Wood, where it once stood, and we had dinner with the local people who had organized this big gathering in at the farm there.
Hmm.
And I just couldn't believe how powerful that experience. I've done this for decades, this work,
Yes.
and there was just a different feeling there. I met a fellow by the name of Mike Vernon. We started to talk. He was a film, he had a videographer background, CBC. He was actually in the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. And then we started to talk about what we could do with this idea. It started in earnest in 2017 when I was able to get some funding.
Hmm.
And and then by just this year, we completed the project. So I was just really entranced by it because for several reasons, which we can speak about. Um, and so I just launched in that journey, and it did take a long time to kind of uh, control and
Hmm.
drop it into 70 minutes, 70 minutes.
Yep.
I It was something I had never made a film that long,
Hmm.
and yet it needed that amount of time, and it could have gone on for another 70 minutes. There's so many elements to this particular battle, and as you
Hmm.
say, there's elements that have been largely forgotten.
Yeah, absolutely. So you do talk during this film about cultural memory. We've mentioned it a little bit earlier. I think it would probably be helpful for some of our listeners just to have a sense from you of what is cultural memory exactly? How are we defining that?
Well, cultural memory is different than history,
Hmm.
and um, we often see history as something where uh, there's evidence. We can dig into the
Yes, it's
archives,
evidence-based.
and we can build it out. And we interpret that information, and we can piece together what happened.
Hmm.
Cultural memory is different. You know, if we think about our own families, and we think about the traditions and rituals that we have every year, you know, and we if we're following Christmas and we get the Christmas tree out and we pull out these ornaments that often have a lot of meaning to us because they were
Yes.
passed down by grandparents, or we bought them on a trip, and we put them up, and they kind of stand as maybe a really important part of who we are, but it's maybe just a piece of plastic or just a simple object, but we invest a lot of emotion in it. And so when we have these kinds of rituals and traditions and objects in our lives, like in a family, it kind of it unifies the family. It brings us together. And the same is true for a community and for a nation. So cultural memory is really how we use the past in the present.
Hmm.
So, and of course, a lot of people say, well, I'm not really interested in history, but they'll know a monument. They'll
Yes.
know a story from the past. They've seen a movie that tells you a bit about the past. And so these little fragments come together. And if you say, oh yeah, have you heard of, the Apollo mission? Oh yeah, I saw a movie about that once, and so people will be able to, present this kind of sense of what they think is history, but it's really kind of a fragmented piece.
Yeah,
And that's really what we call cultural memory. It's dynamic. It changes over time. It can be used politically. It can be
absolutely.
as a form of like carefree nostalgia. Oh, I love the 80s music, right? But at the same time, it can also be used in a dangerous way.
Hmm.
So anytime you hear a phrase like "Make America Great Again,"
Hmm.
there's a calling to a past time which is better, and there's a nostalgia with that. And of course, we ask, okay, what was that time? But there is a sense of there was a past that was better than it is now, and we should
Hmm.
seek that past. So cultural memory can take us in a number of different directions, and we actually use cultural memory a lot when we deal with war memory.
Absolutely.
Have memorials and we have markers that, they give meaning to death. They give meaning to the great loss and the sacrifice that people have made. And they stand in stone and bronze literally forever. and the idea is that they are remembered forever. And of course, the witnesses, those that fought, the veterans, the families, they remember firsthand. It
Hmm.
happened to them. The generations that follow, remembrance means learning. And so therefore, they learn fragments of the past. Because they can't understand, it's just it's humanly not possible to know every day. So we
Yeah.
get elements of the past, and that basically makes up how we understand the past and how we use it today. We can have a dormant monument one day become completely alive because of political discussion or some kind of
Hmm.
issue. No one saw it last week or last year, but all of a sudden it becomes very relevant, and people, might want to take it down, or they might
Hmm.
want to revise it. So these, the past is not safely dead. The
No.
past, the
No.
past is used every day in our lives,
Hmm.
and it can be used in good ways, and it can be used in other ways.
Hmm. I think as well, if you're thinking about it, certainly in a military context and the idea of cultural memory, you think about the difference of remembering the willingness and the remembrance of the First World War in the 1960s, for example, versus, when you're dealing with the Vietnam War and you're dealing with the fallout from all of that and the different wars going on in Southeast Asia, and where there's that sentiment versus where in Canada, certainly there was such an uptick in willingness to engage in public commemoration and memorialization um, after and during and after the war in Afghanistan in the early 2000s, where all of a sudden it was once again a thing for us that for 40 years it seemed like something that, Canada didn't do. And
Mhm.
we were peacekeepers and this was the bad old past that we never had to look at again. And then all of a sudden it became very real of, you have relatives, you have friends, you have people, you're seeing people die. And suddenly there's this, big interest again of let's go to the public ceremonies, let's learn what these are, let's talk about this and in a different way.
Yeah.
Um, but it's a complete, a total evolution of how we think about that and what we've done. So I think it is really salient that you have pointed out the difference between the practice of history as an evidence-based inquiry, or as we like to think it is. Even that, we could probably go way down a rabbit hole on that, versus the idea of public memory and kind of public history as it stands with people, which is, yeah, for a lot of us, it's, or the memory of the family story that turns out to be like 70% true or
Yeah.
70% accurate, that those types of things. That is exactly how you do that. Or, my grandfather told me this, and that's your vision of it forever. And it doesn't matter that factually it might not be right. It's just, grandpa said it was this. Um,
We use, so for Remembrance Day, we use a range of different rituals and traditions that allow us to connect as a community.
mhm.
We all know them.
Yeah,
There's a 2 minute silence. There's usually a reciting of In Flanders Fields.
yeah.
There's singing of hymns. There's the laying of wreaths, and these are all kind of important rituals. Because if you have ritual and tradition and you follow a pattern, patterns are easy to keep.
Hmm.
What happens there's two things that are going on. We collectively remember as a community the sacrifices of those who fought. Then within ourselves, often we're remembering our own family connections to these stories, and maybe our community connections. So there's kind of two layers that are going on. There's the national story, and then there's our personal story. And we often might think that cultural memory and war is all about national identity, but often I find the most powerful connection is social. Is like, I'm a mom or I'm a dad, and my child is this age is a
Hmm.
fighting age. How do I feel about this? Or
Yeah.
would I fight? Would I be willing to climb out of this trench and do this? But if I was with a friend, that might be the thing that would take me forward. You know,
Hmm.
so though it raises many questions for us that allow us to reflect on what's important, and to consider the world today. That I
Mhm.
think is what we're really trying to do with remembrance and that connection to cultural memory. And history weaves into this. It's not like where they're in two separate camps.
No, no,
They
no,
they go
absolutely.
back and forth, and Jay Winter talks about how they weave together over time. And we need them both in a way when we're
Hmm.
looking at the past.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you mentioned something that leads into my next question, which is Flanders Fields. And so getting back to, our topic today before I led you way off into the swamp of memory is, Second Ypres. And it is the origin site of two of the world recognized symbols of remembrance. And you also mentioned a third one, which is the brooding soldier, Clemesha's brooding soldier, which was the runner up for the competition that resulted in the Vimy Memorial. But Second Ypres is also the genesis point of, the poppy as a symbol of remembrance, and also the very famous poem that you just mentioned by John McCrae called In Flanders Fields. But you'd be hard pressed probably to have people be able to connect John McCrae, Flanders Fields, and the poppy to Second Ypres. So why do you think that Second Ypres, given how big it was and how much its symbols are in our memory, why do you think it's forgotten?
Yeah, there is an irony here, and I'm sure listeners are saying, What are they saying that this being forgotten?" Because of course it's so
Everywhere.
literally pinned on us every year
Hmm.
with the poppy, and so therefore there's a connection to April and May of 1915, and John McCrae, as a witness, writes this poem after he loses a dear friend. And really, it's in early May, May 3rd, and he's basically been working as a surgeon since May 22nd, dealing with people that have been asphyxiated.
Hmm.
That's this new word
Yes.
that is coming at them, this asphyxiation. And of course all the other injuries associated with battle that he's thrown into, and it's just such an intense time. Yeah, and there can be a separation of Flanders Fields, and the meaning it tries to convey to us, and that is interpreted over and over again in different ways. The interpretation during the war, the interpretation we make of it after the war, and then today, it varies.
Hmm.
That's an example of cultural memory. Um, it's the interpretation of it that changes. But what I found is that yeah, we're not connected to the key 6 days that follow
Hmm.
April 22nd, when the Canadians are in the line. And there's about 6,000 Canadians that are killed or wounded in those few days. They
Hmm.
step out of the line. The Second Battle of Ypres goes on until the end of May. But the main Canadian involvement are those first few furious days
Hmm.
trying to hold the line, and they're receiving gas attack after gas attack after gas attack. And there's efforts to push the Germans back.
Hmm.
So so there's many different attacks and events that are happening day to day. And there's Mauser Ridge, there's Kitchener's Wood, there's Mauser Ridge, there's the Apex, there's Gravenstoffel. These are all names of events that occurred in those days. And generally, they're lost to terms like Ypres,
Hmm.
Flanders. Flanders is the one that kind of stands on. And after the war, when they're essentially giving battle honors out, and they're trying to figure out what is an official name
Hmm.
of a battle, some of these names get lost. Like St. Julian is used to wrap up a number
Yes.
of different events. They wrap it up into a certain thing. So formally in history, that is kind of wrapping up is a nice way to kind of make kind of sense of the chaos that is the battle. So we have naming issues going on, right? So, and we kind of blur. So if you're from communities of battalions that were linked with Mauser Ridge, you might know all about it, but generally we don't know about those kinds of details.
Hmm.
So details we lose over time. Um, and of course, the other thing is, um, whereas after this, during this is happening, this kind of shock wave that hits people when they get these casualty lists for the first time, it is it's just turns people upside down. There is actually a riot in Victoria after the sinking of the Lusitania, which is
Mm.
May 6th, I believe it was,
Yeah, right on the heels of it all.
right on the heels. So like casualty list, and then there's this Lusitania sinking, and the world just seems to be churned up. So it was so prominent. And then, months later, once McCrae's poem is published, it just seems to be a great way to, remember this critical event. There's also Sir Max Aiken. He publishes a book called In Flanders Fields, which
Yes.
is, sorry, Flanders, Canada in Flanders is what he published. A book that was his effort to make sure that the Canadian story was not forgotten. And those were key elements that kind of kept that story alive. And you're right, after the war, um, when the committees are deciding which battles are going to be remembered by placing a national monument on them, um, it's quickly recognized by people like uh, Sir Arthur Currie that Vimy is going to essentially wash out the memory of a
Hmm.
lot of other battles because of the beautiful Walter Allward Monument, the ridge. And we can think about geography as another force here of forgetting. As a ridge, that monument, as you know, we can see for miles and miles and miles, and
Hmm.
it therefore becomes so iconic for the communities around that. And you can't help but see it. The landscape in Ypres, it undulates. There's little hills. There's Mount Sorel. Passchendaele's at the top of a rise. Those are two national monuments for Canada. Brooding Soldier is kind of in a flat area, so when you stand at the Brooding Soldier Monument, you can't really get a sense of where the front is and where everything is located. So there's not a sense of a park-like setting like Beaumont Hamel or Vimy.
Hmm.
You're really struggling to figure out where's the front line, where's the battlefield. Um, and so all of these, and of course, when you take all these different elements, plus no photography at that time, no film,
Hmm.
what are we have to rely on paintings. We have to
Yeah.
rely on
We
stories.
have the Richard Jack painting for us, and that's our vision of it, which is very painted for a specific reason, with a very specific point of view that now, 100 years later, looks, dare I say, kitschy.
Yeah, I mean, it was very popular at its time,
It's
and
very
that's
popular in the time.
we
Yeah.
we had in the film Stacey Barker,
Yes.
the wonderful curator at the Canadian War Museum, presents those two paintings, those two large paintings,
Hmm.
um, and William Roberts has painted the other one about April 22nd, first gas attack at Ypres, and that's kind of placed well. It's placed right beside the Richard Jack paintings, and they're two different styles. Um, and Roberts is a veteran of the war,
Hmm.
and he's taken a style that's a little bit more violent and chaotic to the kind of more classical imagery that Richard Jack has presented with us. And of course, people wanted to see that. People were
Yeah.
happy with the Richard Jack painting, um, drawing on kind of 19th century styles of battlefield paintings,
Yeah.
like Lady
Yeah.
Butler. Yeah, so
Yeah.
we tried to cover those things. So the film journey is to go to the War Museum and listen to Stacy and to Tim Cook and their perspectives on memory and those objects like paintings. They're
Hmm.
so important to hold our story together.
Hmm. Absolutely. Well, and we could say perhaps that Second Ypres, unlike Vimy, suffers from not having as many totemic objects, let's call them, things like, vision, medals and photographs even and stuff like that. It suffers from it. And then to top it off, it is essentially a defeat. It's a desperate holding of a last line to save the day. It's not exactly pushing them off the ridge in great fashion. It's a
Yeah.
narrative that was fairly typical of the Canadian experience up until 1917, but that we seemed kind of happy to leave behind after that. Because why focus on a brave defeat when you can focus on a victory and a chain of victories, you
Well, I
know?
guess part of the narrative there is that the line was held, that Ypres did not fall. because there was a
Exactly. Yeah.
moment there on April 22nd where had the Germans just continued to march forward, there was nothing stopping them, and they didn't. They stopped. They stopped, and they dug in for the night, and that allowed the Canadians to step into the line and create almost more of an obstacle, created greater pause. So we go from what is kind of seen as the large salient to the small salient, and so that small salient is held. And of course, it's not until July of 1917 and the start of the Passchendaele campaign that Canada is also involved
Hmm.
in come September, October, November, when that whole small salient is pushed back. And, you know, we uh, we see a change in the landscape, a change in the
Hmm.
in the campaign in that 1917, another horrific battle. There
Yeah.
is, I think, a sense though with something like Second Ypres versus a Passchendaele is that Second Ypres, they're wearing cloth caps. There's a sense of the war is soon going to be over. It's still lingering that this
Yeah. Done
you
by
know
Christmas.
trenches are in place, but we don't see that kind of uh, intense structure that you see by 1917. By 1917, there are concrete bunkers. The lines are really formidably reinforced by particularly on the German side, and on the Allied side. But of course, the Allies want to push forward by then. So it's often the chlorine gas attack is seen as this arrival of industrialized warfare. So it is a crucial time in world history, that April, May of 1915, because you see the introduction of gas, you see the introduction of aerial bombing of London citizens towards the end of May. You see the arrival of U-boats with the sinking of the Lusitania.
Yeah.
So warfare changes that particular time, and it's an extraordinary time in history. And I think that's the other thing that is what we might kind of forget about it. We might know of Second Ypres, but its significance in the larger picture of what was happening in April
Hmm.
1915 is really makes it another extraordinary event amongst other extraordinary events. The beginning of the Armenian genocide is happening that week. The Eastern Front is mobilizing to be what is the
Hmm.
campaign for the Germans, which is the massive offensive that would impact the Russians and kind of send them on that trajectory towards ultimate revolution. So there's so much happening in April 1915, and the Canadians have their own experience in that larger world war. Yeah.
Hmm. Absolutely. Um, I really appreciate you spending the time with us today. We'll hope that people who listen have a newer appreciation of Second Ypres and its place in our narrative. So your film, Ways We Remember War, is going to be coming out, we assume. So where can our audience watch it?
Well, if people want to contact me first, if they want to show it in their communities and that kind of thing, we can arrange something like that. And I believe you'll have my information. I'm at Royal Roads University, so you can find me online. The War Heritage Research Initiative has a number of films you can go to see, warheritage.royalroads.ca. And so you can contact me directly. I am hoping to organize an event where we're going to show the film for the 110th anniversary of Second Battle of Ypres. So that will be in April of 2025. So we have an event planned for the Canadian War Museum, and we're arranging events in different parts of the country. And certainly, if you want to be part of that and organize a theater event with me, I'd be happy to participate. And we do a lot of single events. We ultimately will put this online for free. These are free public education films, and that will occur by next summer.
Super. Thank you, Jeff. We're coming down to our last minute, so we're going to get heading on out here, but I really appreciate it again that you've joined us and to discuss Second Deep, this very critical moment in Canada's experience of the First World War. So thank you, Jeff. It's so appreciated. And thank you to our listeners for listening to our fourth season of Beyond the Ridge. Be sure to stay tuned to our series, Forgotten Fronts, as we're continuing to explore topics, one of which you just mentioned, Jeff, which is the Newfoundlanders at Gallipoli. We're looking at munitions manufacture. We're looking at many other topics, including my personal favorite, the Canadian Siberian Expeditionary Force in Siberia at the end of the First World War. So thank you for listening, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you so much.